The wind on Redemption Gulch's boot hill has teeth. It bites at the black-clad shoulders of the half-dozen mourners and tears at the preacher's thin words, scattering them like dust over the raw, open wound in the earth. At the edge of the grave, a small wicker basket sits on the ground, and from it comes the only sound that truly matters, the thin, desperate wail of a week-old infant. The cry is relentless, a needle of pure misery stitching itself into the fabric of the grim afternoon. Nobody moves for the basket. Nobody dares. The child is the final, inconvenient legacy of Sarah Jenkins, a woman the town tolerated in life and was now eager to forget in death. There's more to this story than meets the eye. Before this tale of unexpected compassion unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. The baby is a loose thread, a problem with no clear solution. The women of the town, Goody Gable with her lips pursed into a knot of judgment, the sheriff's wife looking at her own worn boot tips, stand rigid, their hands clenched in their shawls. The men shuffle their feet, their gazes fixed on the pile of dirt that would soon cover their collective discomfort. This child, born of a woman with no husband to name and no family to claim her, is more terrifying to them than the open grave. It represents a sin they could not bury. And so, the infant cries on, alone in a crowd of people. On the rise overlooking the pathetic ceremony, a figure watches, still as the granite outcrops around him. He is a man who exists at the edges of their world, a silent specter they call simply the Apache, and as the final prayer is said and the first shovel of dirt thuds onto the cheap pine box, he begins to move. With a single, silent descent, the course of 2 lives and the conscience of a town is about to be irrevocably altered. He had watched her from a distance for months, not in a predatory way, but with the quiet, detached observation he afforded all the inhabitants of this hardscrabble town. Sarah Jenkins had been like him, an island in a sea of suspicion. She did laundry for the saloon and mended clothes for prospectors, her head always bowed, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. He had traded with her once, a perfectly tanned rabbit pelt for a small sack of flour when his own stores were low. She hadn't flinched from his scarred hands or met his eyes with the fear he was so accustomed to seeing. She had simply nodded, her gratitude a quiet, weary thing. He recognized the look. It was the look of the perpetually displaced. That was why he was here, standing where the sparse grass gave way to rock, witnessing the town's final act of dismissal. Nakai, a name none of them knew or cared to learn, had seen the progression, the subtle swelling of her belly, the way her already slow walk became burdened, the whispers that followed her like stray dogs. And now this, a burial as cold and barren as the land itself. The preacher, Silas Blackwood, a man whose piety was as thin as his frame, droned on about salvation and forgiveness, but his eyes kept flicking to the wailing basket. It was an accusation he couldn't preach away. Sheriff Brody stood beside him, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, a man more comfortable with threats you could see and shoot than the one crying at his feet. Nakai saw their discomfort and understood it perfectly. The baby was a mirror, and they did not like the reflection of their own hard-heartedness. As the mourners began to turn away, eager to retreat to the warmth of their homes and the certainty of their own righteousness, the baby's cries grew louder, more frantic. The cold was setting in. Hunger was a sharp-edged stone in its tiny belly. Goody Gable muttered something to her husband about the county orphanage being a week's ride away, a problem for another day. For now, the child was simply there, an object of pity and revulsion. That was the moment Nakai moved. He didn't stride or sneak. He simply flowed down the gentle slope, his worn moccasins making no sound on the dry earth. Heads turned. A collective breath was drawn. The sight of him, tall and broad-shouldered, his black hair hanging loose past his shoulders, was enough to stop them in their tracks. He was the wilderness they were trying to tame, the past they were trying to bury, walking right into their midst. He ignored their frozen stares, his dark eyes fixed only on the wicker basket. He walked past Sheriff Brody, who made a move to intercept but then stopped, some instinct holding him back. Nakai reached the graveside and knelt. The wind whipped a strand of his hair across his weathered face. He looked into the basket, at the red, scrunched-up face, the tiny fists beating the air. For a long moment, he was still. The crying continued, raw and painful. Then, with a gentleness that seemed utterly alien to the man they thought they knew, he slid his hands under the swaddling and lifted the infant. The movement was sure and practiced. He brought the small, trembling body against the solid warmth of his chest. The baby shuddered, its cries catching in its throat. He adjusted the blanket, tucking it more securely around the child, shielding it from the wind's bite. "Here now." Sheriff Brody finally found his voice, a low rumble of authority. "What do you think you're doing, Apache?" Nakai didn't answer. He didn't even look at the sheriff. He held the baby, his large hand splayed across its back, and slowly began to rock. A low, humming sound started deep in his chest, not a song, just a vibration, a steady, rhythmic comfort. The baby's frantic wails subsided into hiccuping sobs, and then, miraculously, into a shuddering quiet. Its tiny head turned, seeking the source of the warmth, and it settled against the worn leather of his vest. Silence fell over Boot Hill, a profound, ringing silence broken only by the sigh of the wind. The townspeople stared, their faces a mixture of shock, fear, and a dawning, uncomfortable shame. The savage, the outsider they kept at arm's length, was holding the child none of them would touch. "That ain't right," Preacher Blackwood declared, his voice high and reedy. "That child needs a Christian home, not that." Nakai finally lifted his head. His gaze swept over them, from the preacher to the sheriff to the pinched face of Goody Gable. There was no anger in his eyes, only a deep, bottomless contempt that was more unnerving than any threat. It was the look of a man seeing something foul and unworthy. He held their stares for a heart-stopping moment, the now sleeping infant held securely against him. Then, without a word, he turned and began to walk away, back toward the unforgiving hills that were his home. No one moved to stop him. The journey to his cabin was a few miles, but the path was ingrained in his soul. He walked with a steady, ground-eating pace, his focus entirely on the fragile bundle in his arms. The child was impossibly light, yet felt heavier than any burden he had ever carried. It was a life, handed to him by the cowardice of others. His home was a small, solid structure built into the side of a rocky mesa, sheltered from the worst of the winds. It was sparse inside, meticulously clean. A cot, a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table, and shelves holding dried herbs, jerked meat, and tools. It was a place of solitude, a fortress against a world that had taken everything from him once before. The presence of the infant was an immediate and profound disruption. Panic, an emotion he hadn't felt in years, flickered in his gut. What did he know of babies? He laid the child on his cot, on the softest wolf pelt he owned. It stirred, its little mouth working. Hunger. He had goat's milk, but how to give it? He found a piece of clean, soft leather, soaked it in the warm milk, and gently touched it to the baby's lips. After a moment of confusion, the infant began to suckle, weak but determined. The relief that washed over Nakai was so intense it left him weak. He spent the rest of the day in a state of hypervigilance. Every whimper, every sigh from the cot sent a jolt through him. He found a small, intricately carved wooden bird in the folds of the baby's blanket, its wings outstretched. He recognized the mother's handiwork. He had seen her whittling once, her fingers moving with a sad, focused grace. He placed the bird on the stone mantelpiece, a silent promise to its creator. By morning, he knew he couldn't do this alone. The goat's milk would not be enough. He needed supplies. He needed to go back into town. Strapping the baby to his chest with a length of soft deer hide, he set out at dawn, the weight on his chest both a comfort and a terror. Redemption Gulch was already awake, its single dusty street buzzing with a low murmur. As Nakai walked toward the general store, conversations died. Doors creaked shut. Faces appeared in windows, watching. He could feel their eyes on his back, a physical weight of judgment. He ignored it, his expression as impassive as stone. Inside Henderson's mercantile, the air was thick with the smells of coffee, leather, and disapproval. Henderson himself, a balding man with nervous eyes, polished the counter with a rag that had seen better days. Goody Gable stood by the flour barrels, her arms crossed. "I need milk," Nakai said. His voice was rough from disuse, the words simple and direct. Henderson swallowed. For that?" he asked, nodding toward the bundle on Nakai's chest. He stole it, Mrs. Gable hissed, her voice loud enough for the whole store to hear. Stole that poor Christian baby right from its mother's grave. The sheriff should have arrested him. Nakai did not look at her. His focus remained on Henderson. I need milk, he repeated, his voice lower, harder. And flannel. Soft. A tense silence stretched. Henderson looked from Nakai's unyielding face to Mrs. Gable's righteous fury and back again. He was a businessman, but he was also a man who lived by the town's unwritten rules. I don't know if I can sell to you, Apache, he stammered. Folks are saying it ain't proper. The baby chose that moment to stir, letting out a small, hungry cry. The sound cut through the tension, a simple, undeniable truth. It was a child, and it was hungry. Nakai looked down, his expression softening for a fraction of a second as he gently rocked the infant. When he looked back at Henderson, his eyes were burning with a cold fire. He didn't need to speak again. He simply waited. The force of his will, of his silent, righteous stand, filled the small store. Henderson's resolve crumbled. Without another word, he fetched a can of condensed milk and a bolt of the softest flannel he had. Nakai paid with a few small, perfect arrowheads he pulled from a pouch, their obsidian edges gleaming. As he turned to leave, he finally allowed himself to look at Mrs. Gable. He said nothing, but his look stripped her of her piety and left her standing in the ugly nakedness of her prejudice. She flinched as if struck. Over the next few days, a strange routine developed. Nakai cared for the child, whom he had started calling Ayana, a word from his lost people that meant eternal bloom. He learned the rhythms of her hunger, her sleep, her small, gurgling moments of contentment. He fashioned a cradle from woven willow branches and sang her the old songs, the ones his own mother had sung to him. In the quiet of his cabin, the walls that had been built to keep the world out now held a new world within them. He was becoming undone, the layers of his stoicism peeled back by the helpless grip of a tiny hand. But the town was not content to let him be. The whispers grew into a roar. Preacher Blackwood delivered a sermon on heathens and lost lambs, his eyes blazing with fervor. He stirred the pot of fear and righteousness until it was boiling over. A delegation was formed. Sheriff Brody, looking deeply unhappy, was tasked with leading it. They arrived at his cabin one afternoon, a posse of 5 men, their horses stamping nervously. Nakai had heard them coming. He stood in his doorway, Ayana strapped to his chest, awake and watchful. Nakai, Brody said, foregoing the usual slur. It was a sign of grudging respect. The town council has met. They've decided the child needs to be sent to the orphanage over in Silver Creek. We're here to take her. Nakai's posture didn't change, but something in the air around him grew heavy, dangerous. The sun beat down on the hard-packed earth. She has a home, Nakai said, his voice quiet but carrying with absolute clarity. It's not a proper home, the preacher interjected, pushing his horse forward. She needs to be baptized, raised in the church, among her own kind. Her own kind. Nakai's gaze was sharp as a flint knife. Her own kind left her to cry on a grave. Her own kind saw a burden. A sin. His hand came up to gently cup Ayana's head. I see a life. He reached into his vest and pulled out the small, carved bird. He held it up for them to see. Her mother made this. She was not a sin. She was a woman left alone by your proper world. You did not see her. You do not see this child. The men shifted uncomfortably. Brody's face was a mask of conflict. He was a man of the law, and the law was murky here. But what was happening felt less like law and more like theft. The law is on our side, the preacher insisted, his voice rising. Give us the baby, or we'll take it. It was then that another figure appeared, walking up the path from the direction of the town. It was Eleanor Vance, the doctor's wife, a quiet woman known for her kindness. She had seen the posse ride out and had followed on foot, her heart pounding with a terrible premonition. Sheriff, she said, her voice trembling but clear. He's right. All eyes turned to her. Goody Gable may have been the town's voice, but Eleanor Vance was its conscience. We were all there, she continued, stepping forward to stand between the posse and the cabin. At the burial, we all heard her crying. We heard the cold in that wind. And we did nothing. We turned our backs. Whatever else this man is, he did what none of us had the courage or the decency to do. He showed mercy, She looked directly at Preacher Blackwood. "Isn't that what you preach about every Sunday, Silas?" "Mercy." The preacher sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. The other men looked at the ground, at their saddle horns, anywhere but at Eleanor or Nakai. The truth of her words was a bitter pill. Sheriff Brody stared at Nakai for a long, silent moment. He saw the fierce, protective love in the man's eyes. He saw the baby, Ayanna, who was clean, warm, and calm, her little face turned trustingly into Nakai's chest. He saw the simple justice of the situation, a justice that had nothing to do with town councils or written laws. He made his decision. With a heavy sigh, he straightened in his saddle and gathered his reins. "Mount up," he said to his men, his voice thick with finality. "There's nothing for us to do here." He tipped his hat, a gesture of respect so profound it was shocking, toward Nakai and then toward Eleanor. Without another word, he turned his horse and led the shamed, silent posse back toward Redemption Gulch, leaving the preacher alone in a cloud of dust and impotent rage. Silence descended, deep and peaceful. Nakai stood in the doorway, watching them go, the tension slowly bleeding out of him. He looked down at the child in his arms, her eyes wide and trusting. He walked back inside his cabin, the solid thud of the closing door shutting out the world. The small room, once a hermit's refuge, was now a sanctuary for two. The carved bird sat on the mantel, its wooden wings spread as if in silent blessing over the man and the child he had claimed, not with force or law, but with a simple act of compassion. In the quiet that follows the storm, a new world begins. The cabin on the mesa becomes a true home, its silence no longer one of solitude, but of peace. Nakai watches Ayanna sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling, and knows he has found a purpose he thought long dead. He is no longer just the silent Apache, the outcast on the hill. He is a guardian. He is a father. His life, once a straight, lonely path toward the horizon, has now curved to encircle this small, precious child. A few days later, a bundle appears on a flat rock near his path to the spring. It contains 2 cans of milk, a small sack of cornmeal, and a worn but clean baby's gown. There is no note. He knows it comes from the town, an anonymous apology, a quiet admission of a debt that can never be fully repaid. It is a start. He looks out over the valley, at the small cluster of buildings that make up Redemption Gulch. The town is still there. The prejudice hasn't vanished overnight, but a seed of change has been planted. It was planted by a baby's cry and nourished by the courage of an outsider who chose to listen. He picks up the bundle and walks back to the cabin, where Ayanna is just beginning to wake. He sits by the fire, humming a low, ancient melody, and knows, with a certainty that fills his soul, that they are finally home. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. They found their justice and happiness. What part of their journey against prejudice touched you the most? Let us know below.